Dr. Amina Carter stepped out of Chicago Memorial Hospital, the cool night air a stark contrast to the sterile warmth inside. Her shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but a sense of satisfaction lingered from her successful surgeries that day. As chief surgeon, Amina had spent the last 14 hours in back-to-back operations, saving lives and mentoring younger doctors. Her mind was already drifting to the comfort of her bed at home. The parking lot was nearly empty at this late hour. Amina's footsteps echoed as she walked to her car, keys jingling in her hand. She noticed a police cruiser parked near the exit but thought nothing of it. As she pulled out onto the main road, the cruiser's lights flashed to life behind her. Confused, Amina checked her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. She signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. Officer Jake Thompson approached Amina's vehicle, his partner hanging back by their cruiser. Jake's face was set in a hard line, his hand resting near his holster. "License and registration," he barked, before Amina could even roll down her window completely. "Is there a problem, officer?" Amina asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite her growing unease. She handed over her documents, making sure her movements were slow and deliberate. Jake barely glanced at the papers. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Amina's heart raced, but she complied, stepping out into the chilly night air. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Jake ignored her question. "Put your hands on the hood of the car and spread your legs." Disbelief and anger surged through Amina. "Officer, I'm Dr. Amina Carter, chief surgeon at Chicago Memorial. I've just finished a 14-hour shift. What is this about?" Jake's expression hardened. "I said, hands on the hood. Now." Amina hesitated, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. She was a respected surgeon, a pillar of the community. Yet here she was, being treated like a criminal for no apparent reason. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Jake said, his voice low and threatening. "Put your hands on the hood of the car." Amina felt a chill run down her spine. She slowly turned and placed her hands on the hood, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. She could hear Jake's heavy breathing behind her as he roughly patted her down. "Officer, please," Amina tried again. "This is unnecessary. I haven't done anything wrong." Jake's grip on her arm tightened painfully. "Shut up," he growled. "I'll tell you when you can speak." The situation escalated quickly. As Amina tried to turn her head to reason with Jake, he misinterpreted her movement as resistance. In a flash, he grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. Amina cried out in pain and instinctively tried to pull away. Jake's partner, who had been watching silently, finally spoke up. "Thompson, take it easy. She's not resisting." But Jake was beyond listening. He slammed Amina against the side of her car, his forearm pressing against her back. "Stop resisting," he shouted, even though Amina was now completely still, frozen in shock and pain. In that moment, as Amina felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists, she realized that her world had irrevocably changed. Her years of hard work, her position, her respect in the community, none of it mattered in the face of Jake's unchecked prejudice and aggression. As Jake roughly pulled her towards the police cruiser, Amina's mind raced. How would she explain this to her colleagues, to her patients, to her family? The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but a small part of her brain, the part that had gotten her through medical school and grueling surgeries, knew that this moment would define her future actions. Little did Amina know that this traumatic encounter would be the catalyst for a movement that would shake the foundations of Chicago's institutions and force a reckoning with deeply ingrained systemic racism. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast unfamiliar shadows across familiar faces. Dr. Amina Carter, usually the one administering care, now found herself on the receiving end. Her colleagues worked efficiently, their hands gentle, but their eyes filled with a mix of concern and unease. Dr. James Peterson, Amina's longtime friend and fellow surgeon, carefully examined the bruises forming on her wrists and arms. "Amina," he said softly, "we need to document everything. This can't go unreported." Amina nodded, her throat tight. The adrenaline from the encounter with Officer Jake Thompson was fading, replaced by a dull ache that seemed to permeate her entire body. As a nurse photographed her injuries, Amina caught sight of her reflection in a nearby monitor. The woman staring back at her looked beaten, but not broken. Over the next few days, as Amina recovered at home, a steady stream of visitors came to offer support. Colleagues brought food and words of encouragement. Community leaders promised action. Yet, beneath the outpouring of sympathy, Amina sensed an undercurrent of fear. People were angry, yes, but also afraid of challenging the status quo. Alone in the quiet of her apartment, Amina reflected on her journey. She thought about her parents, immigrants who had sacrificed everything to give her opportunities. She remembered the microaggressions she'd faced throughout medical school and her residency. The subtle doubts, the extra scrutiny, the constant need to prove herself. She'd pushed through it all, telling herself that excellence was the best revenge. But now, lying on her couch with ice packs on her bruises, Amina realized that individual success wasn't enough. The system itself needed to change. With trembling hands, she opened her laptop and began to type. At first, the words came slowly, a recounting of the incident with Jake, factual and detached. But as she continued writing, something shifted. Amina found herself pouring out years of pent-up frustration and anger. She wrote about the subtle racism she'd encountered in the hospital, the patients who'd questioned her expertise, the colleagues who'd made backhanded compliments about how articulate she was. Before she knew it, Amina had written a 5,000-word essay that was part personal narrative, part scathing indictment of systemic racism in healthcare and law enforcement. Her finger hovered over the Publish button on her newly created blog. For a moment, doubt crept in. Publishing this could jeopardize her career, her reputation. But then she remembered the feeling of Jake's hands roughly shoving her against the car, and her resolve hardened. She hit Publish. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Amina's post had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Her inbox flooded with messages, some offering support, others sharing similar experiences, and a few containing thinly veiled threats. Local news outlets picked up the story. Amina found herself fielding calls from reporters, activists, and even a few politicians. Her blog quickly became a hub for discussions about racial disparities in healthcare and police brutality. As the days passed, Amina's bruises faded, but her determination grew stronger. She began researching, compiling statistics on racial bias in medical treatment outcomes. She reached out to other professionals of color, collecting their stories. Each new post on her blog gained more traction than the last. One evening, as Amina was preparing for a television interview, she received a call from Dr. Peterson. "Amina," he said, his voice tight with emotion, "I need to apologize. I've worked alongside you for years, and I never fully understood what you were going through. Your writing, it's opened my eyes, and I'm not the only one. People are talking, Amina. Things are changing." Amina gripped her phone tightly, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time since the incident, she felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was becoming a voice for change. As she prepared to share her story with a national audience, Amina knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready for the fight. With each word she wrote, each interview she gave, each person she inspired to speak up, Amina was helping to build a movement that would challenge the very foundations of systemic racism. Little did she know that her words would soon reach Officer Jake Thompson himself, setting in motion a chain of events that would test both of their convictions and ultimately lead to an unexpected confrontation. Officer Jake Thompson sat in the locker room of the police station, his head in his hands. The bustling sounds of his fellow officers preparing for their shifts faded into the background as he replayed the incident with Dr. Amina Carter in his mind for the 100th time. "Hey, Thompson," called out Officer Mike Daniels, slapping Jake on the back. "You coming to O'Malley's tonight? First round's on me." Jake looked up, forcing a smile. "Thanks, but I think I'll pass." Mike's expression turned serious. "Look, man, you can't keep beating yourself up over this. It was a routine stop. These things happen." Jake felt a surge of anger. "Routine? I assaulted a doctor, Mike. There was nothing routine about it." Mike lowered his voice, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Listen, we've all been there. Sometimes things get out of hand. But we stick together, right? The department's got your back on this." Jake nodded silently, but the words rang hollow. As Mike walked away, Jake opened his locker and stared at his reflection in the small mirror inside. The face looking back at him seemed older, more haggard than he remembered. At home that evening, Jake poured himself a drink and turned on the TV. He nearly choked when he saw Dr. Amina Carter's face on the screen. She was being interviewed about her blog post, which had apparently gone viral. Jake listened, transfixed, as Amina eloquently described her experiences with racism in the medical field and her recent encounter with the police. "The system is broken," Amina was saying. "But it's not just about one bad officer. It's about a culture that allows these incidents to happen, that protects those responsible instead of holding them accountable." Jake turned off the TV, his hands shaking. He'd always prided himself on being a good cop, on protecting and serving his community, but Amina's words forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Had he really been protecting everyone equally? The next day at work, Jake found himself paying closer attention to his colleagues' behavior. He noticed the way some officers tensed up when dealing with people of color, the casual racist jokes in the break room, the subtle differences in how suspects were treated based on their skin color. As he patrolled his beat, Jake's mind wandered to his childhood. He'd grown up in a predominantly white neighborhood, his understanding of race shaped by stereotypes and secondhand accounts. Becoming a police officer had seemed like a noble calling, a way to make a difference. Now he wondered if he'd been perpetuating the very problems he thought he was solving. A week after the incident, Jake received a call from an old friend, Officer James Wilson, who worked in a different precinct. "Jake, got a minute? I need to talk to you about something." They met at a small diner, away from their usual haunts. James looked nervous as he stirred his coffee. "I saw the news about that doctor you arrested," he began. It hit close to home." Jake leaned forward, curious. James took a deep breath before continuing. "My brother, he experienced something similar a few years back. Racial profiling, excessive force, the works. It tore our family apart, man. He hasn't spoken to me since I defended the officers involved." The revelation hit Jake like a punch to the gut. James had always been one of the good ones in his mind. To hear him talk about his own family's experience with police brutality was jarring. "I've been thinking a lot about it lately," James continued. "About the job, about what we're really doing out there. I can't shake the feeling that we're part of the problem, Jake." As Jake drove home that night, his mind was in turmoil. He thought about Amina, about James's brother, about all the times he might have misjudged a situation based on his own biases. The certainty he'd once felt about his role as a police officer was crumbling. Sitting in his living room, Jake opened his laptop and, with a sense of trepidation, navigated to Amina's blog. As he read through her posts, her words challenged everything he thought he knew about race and policing. The stories she shared from other people of color in the community painted a picture of systemic injustice that he could no longer ignore. Jake closed the laptop, his decision made. He knew what he had to do, but the path ahead was unclear and fraught with danger. Speaking out against his fellow officers, admitting his own culpability. It could cost him his job, his friends, maybe even his safety. But as he thought about Amina's courage in sharing her story, he realized he couldn't stay silent any longer. Tomorrow, he would take the first step towards making things right. But little did Jake know that his journey towards redemption would lead him to unexpected allies and formidable enemies, testing his resolve in ways he never imagined. The sun had barely risen over Chicago when the first protesters began to gather in front of the police station. What started as a small group quickly swelled into a crowd of hundreds. At the center of it all stood Dr. Amina Carter, her voice strong despite the lingering pain from her encounter with Officer Jake Thompson. "We are here today not just because of what happened to me," Amina called out, her words amplified by a megaphone. "We are here because my story is just one of many. It's time for change, and that change starts now." The crowd erupted in cheers. Signs bobbed above the sea of faces, bearing slogans like "Black Lives Matter" and "End Police Brutality." News vans lined the street, their cameras trained on Amina and the growing crowd. Among the protesters was Sarah Jenkins, a nurse who worked with Amina at the hospital. She had never attended a protest before, but Amina's story had struck a chord. "I've seen how patients treat Dr. Carter differently," Sarah told a reporter. "I always knew it was wrong, but I never knew what to do about it. Now I do." As Amina continued to speak, sharing statistics on racial disparities in policing and healthcare, the energy of the crowd intensified. People from all walks of life had come together: doctors, teachers, students, and community leaders. Each had their own story of discrimination or witnessed injustice. Inside the police station, Jake Thompson watched the protest unfold on a monitor in the break room. He recognized faces in the crowd, people he had sworn to protect and serve. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. "Can you believe this circus?" Officer Mike Daniels scoffed, entering the room. "They'll get bored and go home soon enough." Jake said nothing, his eyes fixed on Amina's image on the screen. Her words from her blog post echoed in his mind. "Silence in the face of injustice is complicity." As the morning wore on, the protest showed no signs of dissipating. Instead, it grew. Local business owners arrived with water and snacks for the protesters. Community organizers circulated with clipboards, gathering signatures for petitions demanding police reform. Amina, her voice growing hoarse but her spirit undiminished, introduced a series of speakers, each with their own story of racial profiling or police misconduct. A young man described being stopped and frisked repeatedly on his way to college classes. A grandmother tearfully recounted her grandson's arrest for simply playing in a park after dark. The stories had a profound effect on the crowd. What had started as anger began to transform into a sense of shared purpose and determination. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about changing a system. As the protest entered its fifth hour, city officials began to take notice. The mayor's office released a statement promising to look into the allegations and take appropriate action. But for the protesters, vague promises weren't enough. "We demand concrete changes," Amina shouted. Her words met with thunderous applause. "Body cameras on all officers, implicit bias training, community oversight boards. We won't stop until we see real reform." The protest was being live-streamed across social media platforms, and support poured in from around the country. Justice for Amina and Chicago for Change became trending topics. Other cities began organizing solidarity protests. As evening approached, Amina prepared to wrap up the day's events. But before she could, a commotion near the police station doors caught everyone's attention. A group of officers was exiting the building, led by none other than Jake Thompson. The crowd tensed, many expecting confrontation. But Jake's demeanor was different. his shoulders slumped, his eyes downcast. He approached the protest line slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Dr. Carter," he called out, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. I'd like to speak with you." A hush fell over the gathering. Amina, surprise evident on her face, nodded to her security team. As she made her way towards Jake, the crowd parted, creating a path between the two unlikely adversaries. In that moment, with tensions high and all eyes upon them, no one could have predicted the profound impact this encounter would have, not just on Amina and Jake, but on the entire city of Chicago. As Amina and Jake stood face to face, the future hung in the balance. Would this be a moment of reconciliation or further division? The answer would shape the course of their movement and test the limits of forgiveness and redemption. Jake Thompson sat in his car, parked outside his mother's modest suburban home. He'd been there for 20 minutes, gathering the courage to go inside. The events of the past few weeks, the incident with Dr. Amina Carter, the protest, his growing doubts about his role as a police officer, had left him feeling adrift. He hoped that a visit to his childhood home might help him find some clarity. Finally, Jake made his way to the front door. His mother, Ellen Thompson, greeted him with a warm hug. "Jake, honey, what a surprise. Come in, come in." As they settled in the living room with cups of coffee, Ellen studied her son's face. "What's wrong, Jake? You look troubled." Jake took a deep breath. "Mom, I've done something I'm not proud of." Haltingly, he began to recount the incident with Amina, the subsequent protest, and his growing realization about the systemic issues within the police force. Ellen listened silently, her expression unreadable. When Jake finished, she set down her coffee cup and sighed. "Oh, Jake, I was hoping you'd never have to face this." Confused, Jake leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Ellen stood up and walked to an old bookshelf, pulling out a worn photo album. "There's something I need to show you." She opened the album to reveal a photo of a young Ellen with a black man, both smiling widely. "This is Marcus," Ellen explained. "He was my best friend in college, and he's the reason I started to question everything I'd been taught about race." Jake stared at the photo, shocked. His mother had never mentioned Marcus before. Ellen continued, her voice soft with remembrance. "I grew up in a very different time, Jake. My parents, your grandparents, they were racist. There's no other way to put it. And I was too, without even realizing it." She went on to describe how her friendship with Marcus had opened her eyes to the realities of systemic racism. "It wasn't easy, Jake. Challenging beliefs you've held your whole life never is. But Marcus was patient with me, even when I didn't deserve it." Jake listened, a mix of emotions swirling within him. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" Ellen's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was protecting you. I wanted you to grow up without the burden of prejudice, but now I see that by not talking about it, I may have allowed those old biases to persist in a different form." She reached for a small box on a nearby shelf and handed it to Jake. Inside was a journal, its pages yellowed with age. "I wrote this during that time," Ellen explained. "It's a record of my journey, my struggles, my growth. I want you to read it, Jake. Maybe it can help you, like Marcus helped me." Jake opened the journal with trembling hands, reading the first entry. "April 15th, 1985. I met a black student in my biology class today. His name is Marcus. He seems nice, but Mom always said we shouldn't mix with their kind. I don't know what to think." As Jake read on, he saw his mother's transformation unfold on the pages. Her initial prejudices gave way to confusion, then understanding, and finally a fierce commitment to equality. The last entry read, "September 3rd, 1987. Marcus is moving away for grad school. I'll miss him terribly, but I'm grateful for everything he's taught me." I promise to carry these lessons with me always, and to raise my children to see the humanity in everyone." Jake looked up at his mother, tears in his eyes. "Mom, I don't know what to say." Ellen took his hand. "You don't have to say anything, honey. But you do have to act. You have a chance to make things right, to be part of the change. It won't be easy, but it's necessary." As Jake left his mother's house that evening, the weight of her revelations and his own actions pressed heavily upon him. He knew what he had to do, but the path forward was daunting. How could he make amends for his actions? How could he challenge a system he'd been a part of for so long? With his mother's journal tucked under his arm, Jake drove home, his mind racing. He realized that his journey, like his mother's before him, was just beginning, and somewhere across the city, unbeknownst to him, Dr. Amina Carter was preparing for a confrontation that would change both their lives forever. The television studio buzzed with activity as producers and technicians prepared for the live interview. Dr. Amina Carter sat in the makeup chair, her eyes closed as the artist applied the finishing touches. Despite her calm exterior, Amina's mind raced. This interview on a national news program was her biggest platform yet to discuss police brutality and systemic racism. "Dr. Carter, we're on in 5, a production assistant called out. Amina opened her eyes, took a deep breath, and made her way to the set. As the cameras rolled, the interviewer dove right in. "Dr. Carter, your story has captivated the nation. Can you tell us what drives you to continue speaking out, despite the backlash you've faced?" Amina leaned forward, her voice steady and clear. "It's not about me anymore. It's about every person of color who has faced discrimination, every life cut short by police violence, every dream deferred because of systemic racism. We can't afford to be silent." As the interview progressed, Amina articulated her vision for change, reform in policing, addressing racial disparities in healthcare, and the importance of education and empathy. "We're not asking for special treatment," she emphasized. "We're asking for equal treatment, for the chance to live without fear." Miles away, in his small apartment, Officer Jake Thompson sat transfixed in front of his television. He had been avoiding the media coverage of the incident, but something compelled him to watch this interview. As Amina spoke about the importance of dialogue and understanding, Jake felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. The interviewer's next question caught both Amina and Jake off guard. "Dr. Carter, if you could speak directly to the officer involved in your assault, what would you say to him?" Amina paused, considering her words carefully. "I would say, I don't hate you. Hate perpetuates the cycle of violence and misunderstanding. What I want is for you to recognize the harm you've caused, not just to me, but to the trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. I want you to be part of the solution." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had expected anger, even calls for his prosecution. But Amina's words of potential reconciliation shook him to his core. As the interview concluded, Jake found himself reaching for his phone. Before he could second-guess himself, he dialed the station's public comment line. "This is Officer Jake Thompson," he said, his voice trembling slightly. I need to speak with Dr. Carter." The next day, Amina was reviewing patient charts in her office when her assistant knocked on the door. "Dr. Carter, there's an Officer Thompson here to see you. He says it's important." Amina froze, her pen hovering above the paper. She had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, she felt unprepared. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. "Send him in." Jake entered the office, his police uniform replaced by civilian clothes. He looked smaller somehow, less imposing than Amina remembered. "Dr. Carter," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Jake Thompson. I'm the officer who—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Amina stood, her posture rigid, I remember you, Officer Thompson. What can I do for you? Jake swallowed hard. I saw your interview last night. I wanted to apologize. What I did to you was inexcusable. I've been grappling with my actions, with my beliefs, and I realize now how wrong I was. Amina's expression remained neutral. An apology is a start, Officer Thompson. But what do you intend to do about it? I want to make things right, Jake said, his voice growing stronger. I want to be part of the change you talked about. I don't expect forgiveness. But if there's any way I can help your cause, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. For a long moment, Amina studied Jake's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finally, she spoke. Officer Thompson, I appreciate you coming here, but trust is earned. If you're serious about making amends, it won't be easy. Are you prepared for that? Jake nodded, a look of determination settling on his face. I am. Whatever it takes. Amina gestured to a chair. Then sit down, Officer Thompson. We have a lot to discuss. As Jake took a seat, neither he nor Amina could have predicted the impact this conversation would have, not just on their lives, but on the entire movement for police reform and racial justice in Chicago. Their unlikely alliance was about to spark a controversy that would test the limits of forgiveness, redemption, and social change. The conference room at Chicago Memorial Hospital was packed. Dr. Amina Carter sat at the head of the table, flanked by community leaders, fellow medical professionals, and, to everyone's surprise, Officer Jake Thompson. The unlikely pair had spent weeks preparing for this moment, the launch of their joint initiative for police reform and community healing. Thank you all for coming, Amina began, her voice steady. We're here today to present our proposal for the Chicago Community Police Reconciliation Project. Jake stood up, visibly nervous but determined. As a police officer who has confronted my own biases and mistakes, I believe this project is crucial for rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve. As they outlined their plan, which included enhanced diversity training for officers, a citizen review board for police conduct, and community outreach programs, the room's atmosphere shifted from skepticism to cautious optimism. However, not everyone was on board. Captain Richards, Jake's superior, spoke up, his voice laced with barely concealed anger. Officer Thompson, while your intentions might be good, this proposal undermines the authority of the police force. We can't have civilians dictating how we do our job. Amina interjected, Captain, with all due respect, the goal isn't to undermine authority, but to enhance accountability and restore community trust. The debate grew heated. Some officers supported Jake, seeing the need for change, while others sided with the captain, viewing the proposal as a threat to their way of life. In the weeks that followed, Amina and Jake faced an uphill battle. They held town halls, met with community groups, and lobbied city officials. Each small victory was met with fierce resistance. One evening, as they left a particularly contentious meeting at City Hall, Jake noticed a group of his fellow officers watching them from across the street. Their hostile glares sent a chill down his spine. Amina, he said quietly, I think we need to be careful. Not everyone is happy about what we're doing. Amina nodded grimly. I know. I've been receiving threats, but we can't back down now. We're making progress. Indeed, their efforts were gaining traction. Local media picked up the story, framing it as a tale of redemption and cross-cultural understanding. Support from the community grew, with more citizens showing up at each event to voice their approval. However, the backlash intensified as well. Jake was ostracized by many of his colleagues, facing silent treatment and accidental schedule changes that left him working undesirable shifts. Amina received anonymous threats, forcing her to hire personal security. Despite the challenges, they pressed on. The turning point came when they organized a community police dialogue event officers and residents sat face to face, sharing their experiences and fears. The raw, honest conversations that unfolded were both painful and cathartic. One young officer, tears in his eyes, spoke about the fear he felt every time he put on his uniform, knowing he might not come home. A community elder shared stories of decades of harassment and profiling. As the night wore on, a tentative understanding began to emerge. Jake and Amina watched from the sidelines, exhausted but hopeful. "We're making a difference," Amina said softly. Jake nodded. "But we've got a long way to go." As they left the event, a group of young activists approached them. "Dr. Carter, Officer Thompson," one of them said, "we want to help. What you're doing, it's important. How can we get involved?" Amina and Jake exchanged glances, a spark of excitement in their eyes. This was what they had been working towards: grassroots support, a groundswell of people ready to engage in the hard work of systemic change. "Come to our next planning meeting," Amina said. "We need all the help we can get." As the group dispersed, Jake's phone buzzed. It was a text from Captain Richards. "My office, tomorrow, 8 a.m. sharp." Jake showed the message to Amina, his expression grim. "Looks like the department is making its move." Amina squared her shoulders. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever happens tomorrow, Jake, know that what we're doing is right." As they parted ways for the night, both Amina and Jake felt the weight of their choices. They had started something bigger than themselves, a movement that was gaining momentum. But with that momentum came greater risks and more powerful opposition. Tomorrow would be a test of their resolve, their partnership, and their vision for a more just Chicago. Little did they know that the confrontation awaiting them would catapult their local initiative into the national spotlight, bringing both unprecedented support and dangerous new enemies. The community center auditorium was filled to capacity, with people spilling out into the hallway. Dr. Amina Carter and Officer Jake Thompson stood on the stage, surrounded by a diverse group of supporters: activists, reformed officers, community leaders, and everyday citizens. The energy in the room was electric. 6 months ago, Amina began, her voice carrying across the packed room, Officer Thompson and I stood on opposite sides of a divide that seemed insurmountable. Today we stand here together, proof that change is possible when we have the courage to confront our biases and work together. Jake stepped forward, his posture straight, but his eyes humble. What started as a personal journey of redemption has become something much bigger. Our Chicago Community Police Reconciliation Project has made real progress, but we're just getting started. As they detailed the achievements of the past months, the implementation of de-escalation training for officers, the establishment of a citizen review board, and the launch of community policing initiatives, the audience listened intently, punctuating key points with applause and cheers. But it wasn't just the local community paying attention. National news outlets had picked up the story, framing it as a potential model for police reform across the country. Amina and Jake found themselves fielding calls from activists and officials in other cities, all eager to learn from their experience. The growth wasn't without its challenges. As Jake left the event, he noticed a group of his former colleagues watching from across the street, their expressions a mix of disappointment and anger. The department had been split by his actions, with some officers embracing the changes and others resisting fiercely. Meanwhile, Amina was dealing with pushback from some activists who felt she was being too conciliatory. "You can't cooperate with the oppressors," one passionate young woman had shouted at a recent meeting. Amina understood the anger, but she remained convinced that dialogue and cooperation were the paths to lasting change. Despite the obstacles, the movement continued to gain momentum. A major breakthrough came when a prominent civil rights organization offered to partner with them, providing resources and national exposure. Suddenly, Amina and Jake found themselves preparing to speak at a conference in Washington, D.C. As they stood backstage at the conference, Jake turned to Amina, his expression serious. "Did you ever think we'd end up here when you first started your blog?" Amina shook her head, a small smile on her lips. "Never, but I'm glad we did." Their speech was met with a standing ovation. As they fielded questions from the audience, it became clear that their approach, combining grassroots activism with institutional reform, was resonating with people across the country. Back in Chicago, the impact of their work was becoming increasingly visible. Crime rates in neighborhoods with community policing initiatives had begun to drop. Trust between officers and residents was slowly being rebuilt. It wasn't perfect. There were still incidents of misconduct, still protests and tensions, but there was undeniable progress. One evening, as Amina and Jake left a late-night strategy session, they were approached by a young boy and his mother. The woman spoke hesitantly. "Dr. Carter, Officer Thompson, I just wanted to thank you. My son used to be terrified of the police, but after attending one of your community events, he told me he wants to be an officer when he grows up, to help make things better." Amina and Jake exchanged glances, both moved by the woman's words. It was moments like these that made all the struggles worthwhile. As they parted ways that night, neither of them could have anticipated the storm that was brewing. Their success had not gone unnoticed by those with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Powerful forces were aligning against them, preparing to test their resolve and the strength of their movement in ways they couldn't imagine. The next day would bring news that would shake their coalition to its core and force them to confront the true cost of the change they sought. The real battle, it seemed, was just beginning. The tension in the police station was palpable as Jake Thompson made his way to Captain Richards' office. He could feel the eyes of his fellow officers on him, a mix of curiosity, resentment, and, in some cases, grudging respect. As he knocked on the captain's door, Jake steeled himself for what he knew would be a difficult conversation. "Enter," came the gruff response from inside. Jake stepped into the office to find not just Captain Richards, but also Chief of Police Harrison, and two men in suits he didn't recognize. The atmosphere was thick with hostility. "Officer Thompson," Captain Richards began, his voice cold. "I think you know why you're here." Before Jake could respond, Chief Harrison interjected. "Your little crusade with Dr. Carter has gone too far, Thompson. You're undermining the entire department, making us look weak and incompetent." Jake took a deep breath. "Sir, with all due respect, our project is about strengthening the relationship between the police and the community. It's about making us more effective, not weaker." One of the suited men, who introduced himself as a representative from the police union, stepped forward. "We've been reviewing your activities, Officer Thompson, your association with known activists, your public criticism of department policies. It's grounds for dismissal." Jake felt a chill run down his spine, but he stood his ground. If speaking the truth and working to improve our practices is grounds for dismissal, then maybe it's time to reevaluate what this badge really stands for. The room erupted into heated argument. Accusations flew, threats were made, and at one point, Captain Richards slammed his fist on the desk in frustration. Through it all, Jake remained calm, defending the work he and Amina had done and the positive changes they'd seen in the community. As the confrontation reached its peak, there was a commotion outside the office. The door burst open, and to everyone's surprise, Dr. Amina Carter walked in, flanked by a team of lawyers and community leaders. "Gentlemen," Amina said, her voice steady and authoritative, "I believe this discussion concerns me as well." The room fell silent as Amina laid out a series of documents on the captain's desk. These are testimonials from community members, statistics showing improved police-community relations, and letters of support from city council members. What Officer Thompson and I are doing isn't undermining the police. It's evolving policing to meet the needs of our community. One of the lawyers stepped forward. "Any action taken against Officer Thompson will be met with immediate legal challenge. The eyes of the nation are on this department now. The chief of police, his face red with anger, pointed at Amina. "You have no right to be here. This is a police matter." "No," Jake said, finding his voice again. "This is a community matter, and Dr. Carter represents the community we've sworn to protect and serve." For a tense moment, it seemed the situation might escalate further. But then, unexpectedly, one of the suited men, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up. "I think we need to consider this carefully. The publicity alone." His words were cut off by the sound of commotion outside. Through the office window, they could see a large crowd gathering in front of the station. News vans were pulling up, reporters already setting up their cameras. Captain Richards moved to the window, his expression a mix of disbelief and resignation. "What the hell is going on out there?" Amina stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "That's the voice of the people, Captain. They're here to support Officer Thompson and the changes we're trying to make. This isn't just about one officer or one incident anymore. It's about the future of policing in our city." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This confrontation had just become very public, and the whole city, perhaps the whole country, was watching. Chief Harrison, his earlier bravado deflated, sank into a chair. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice weary. Jake and Amina exchanged glances. This was the moment they had been working towards, the opportunity to effect real, lasting change. But as they prepared to lay out their demands, they knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Changing policies was one thing. Changing hearts and minds would be a much longer, harder battle. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, their chants for justice and reform echoing through the streets of Chicago. The final confrontation had begun, and its outcome would shape the future of the city for years to come. The days following the confrontation at the police station were a whirlwind of activity. Dr. Amina Carter and Officer Jake Thompson found themselves at the center of a media storm, their faces plastered across national news outlets. The story had captured the public's imagination, a tale of unlikely allies fighting for change in a system resistant to reform. But as their profile rose, so did the stakes. Jake, who had managed to keep his job thanks to the public support and legal pressure, began to notice strange occurrences. His locker at the station was vandalized, his car tires were slashed, and he received anonymous threatening phone calls in the middle of the night. Amina too faced increasing hostility. She was accosted by angry police supporters while leaving the hospital one evening. Barely escaping thanks to her security detail, the hospital administration, under pressure from powerful donors, began to question her continued employment. Despite these challenges, Amina and Jake pressed on. They used their newfound platform to push for comprehensive police reform, testifying before the city council and appearing on national talk shows. Their partnership, once viewed with skepticism, was now being hailed as a model for community police reconciliation. However, a group of corrupt officers, led by Jake's former partner, Officer Mike Daniels, was determined to put an end to their efforts. They began to fabricate evidence, planning to frame Jake for evidence tampering and drug possession. One night, as Jake was leaving a community meeting, he was ambushed by Daniels and his cohorts. They planted drugs in his car and called for backup, intending to arrest him on the spot. But what they didn't know was that Amina, anticipating such a move, had hired a private investigator to keep an eye on Jake. The entire incident was caught on camera, exposing the corrupt officer's plot. The footage quickly went viral, sparking outrage across the city and beyond. Daniels and his accomplices were arrested, and an internal affairs investigation was launched into the department. As the scandal unfolded, Jake made a difficult decision. In a press conference that shocked the city, he announced his resignation from the police force. "I can no longer be part of a system that resists change so vehemently," he declared, "but I will continue to fight for reform as a private citizen." alongside Dr. Carter and all those who believe in justice. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. The police chief was forced to resign, and the mayor announced a commission to overhaul the department's policies and training programs. Amina and Jake were invited to be key members of this commission, their experience and vision now seen as invaluable. In the midst of these systemic changes, personal transformations were also taking place. Officers who had once viewed Jake as a traitor began to reach out, seeking guidance on how to better serve their communities. Activists who had been skeptical of working with police found themselves engaged in productive dialogues with reform-minded officers. Amina, too, saw the impact of their work in her daily life. Patients of color reported feeling more comfortable seeking medical care, knowing that the hospital was actively addressing issues of racial bias in healthcare. As the dust settled, Amina and Jake found themselves standing once again in front of a crowd. This time, it was at the groundbreaking ceremony for the new Chicago Center for Community Policing and Racial Justice, a facility dedicated to training officers in de-escalation techniques, cultural competency, and community engagement. "A year ago, I was a victim of police brutality," Amina began, her voice strong and clear. "Today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as an agent of change." Jake stepped forward, his expression one of humility and determination. "And I stand here not as a former officer seeking redemption, but as a citizen committed to building a just and equitable system for all." As they cut the ribbon together, the crowd erupted in cheers. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but Amina and Jake had proven that change was possible. Their story of revenge transformed into redemption had become a beacon of hope for cities across the nation. In the back of the crowd, a young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he said, his eyes shining with admiration, "when I grow up, I want to be like them." The mother smiled, tears in her eyes. "You can be, honey. They've shown us all that we can be better, if we're brave enough to try." As the ceremony concluded, Amina and Jake shared a look of quiet understanding. Their work was far from over, but they had laid the foundation for lasting change. The future, for the first time in a long while, looked bright with promise.